Hey AP Government class, this is Mr. Sharon here. So the last few weeks I've been assigning a lot about these required Supreme Court cases. So part of the AP exam requires you to know 15 different Supreme Court cases, and they want you to know them very well. There's a chance that you might have to write about one of these, and they don't specify very clearly exactly which one. It could be any one of the 15, so we really have to make sure we know these well. Especially because with the AP exam changes, they are covering information from the first 3 units of the course, which would include any of these Supreme Court cases. So this is still material that you could see on the AP exam. All right, so the first one I want to talk about, just to give you an overview, make sure we understand what these cases are all about, is McCulloch versus Maryland from 1819. So the basics of the case is in 1816, Congress created a second bank of the United States for some general purposes to control currency, to make sure the United States was still using one specific currency, that the states weren't using different forms of money. It was also meant to help regulate the banking system in general, to make sure banks weren't loaning out too much money or doing other practices that could pretty much crash our economy. We do have a central banking system today, on the Federal Reserve System. This is kind of the foundation of that in the early years. So a couple years after the Second Bank of the United States was created, there was a branch of it in Maryland. It was actually in Baltimore. The state of Maryland had a policy that they taxed banks within the state. So this was a state government issuing the tax. They tried to tax this branch of the national bank. So this was like the state government taxing the national government. And this guy McCulloch, who was the main cashier at the Maryland branch of the National Bank, or the Second Bank of the United States, refused to pay the tax to the state of Maryland. So this case ended up getting taken all the way up to the Supreme Court. And some of the key questions here were, first of all, does the national government even have the power to create a national bank? Because it doesn't say anything about that in the Constitution. It's not an expressed power. And another key question is, can a state government tax an institution of the national government, which could bring in some issues with the Supremacy Clause. So the key outcome here that we want to understand is the Supreme Court decided in this case that the national government does have the power to create a national bank due to the Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1 of the Constitution. So the Necessary and Proper Clause, also known as the Elastic Clause, is what Congress bases a lot of its laws off of, because a lot of the things Congress does today aren't mentioned anywhere within the wording of the Constitution. What Congress says is, oh, we're going to pass this specific law because it's necessary to carry out our expressed powers. So if Congress has the power to declare war, or to control commerce, regulating interstate and foreign trade, they could pass laws related to those and say, well, we had to pass this specific law because we have the power to control commerce in the United States, to control trade between the states, even if it doesn't specifically say they can do something. A pretty good example of this is the Interstate Highway Act in the 1950s. So the law that created our national highway system was based around really the Commerce Clause, because Congress argued, yes, it doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that we have the ability to create a national interstate highway system, but it does say we control commerce. And in order to promote people traveling from state to state to buy things, which is what commerce is all about, they need a method to do that, and being able to travel by car on interstate highways makes that possible. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a necessary and proper clause. So McCullough versus Maryland was a big victory for the necessary and proper clause to strengthen that, and Congress would start using it a lot more in the future. Because once again, it didn't say anywhere in the Constitution that they could create this bank, but they did so, and they cited the necessary and proper clause. The other big thing here was a state government cannot tax the national government, and this goes back to the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 of the Constitution. The laws set forth in the Constitution and those powers of the national government, according to Article 6, are supreme to any state laws. So when there is a conflict between a national law and a state law, the national government wins out according to the Supremacy Clause. So, two key parts of the Constitution strengthened early in our nation's history: necessary and proper clause and the Supremacy Clause, which definitely gave a leg up to the national government over state governments, really for the first clear time in U.S. history. All right, the next case we're going to look at is United States versus Lopez, which was 1995, so a little more recent, a lot more recent actually. So the main details of the case: there was a 12th grade high school student, Alfonso Lopez, who carried a concealed weapon into his San Antonio, Texas high school. So this was a violation of a state law, and originally he was arrested and charged based on a violation of a state law carrying a gun into a school zone, but then the federal government took over. They ended up taking on this case and charging him, which he was, I believe, sentenced to around 6 months in jail and then about 2 years of probation. The federal government charged him as a result of a law they had passed in 1990 called the Gun-Free School Zones Act, which made carrying a weapon knowingly into a school zone a federal crime. So Congress had based this law on the Commerce Clause. So this is kind of a stretch, almost like another use of the necessary and proper clause here. They argued that school is essentially a place of business. There's some kind of business happening, plus students are being educated in a school setting. Education leads to commerce later down the road because people need an education to get a job. When you have a job, you are making money, you're being productive, and that helps commerce at the national level. And bringing a gun into a school zone interrupts that whole process. So Congress says, hey, we have the ability to ban guns in a school zone based on the Commerce Clause. Once again, this is a big stretch of congressional power. And the key questions that come to mind, obviously, the Second Amendment. Does the national government have the power to make a law restricting your Second Amendment right to bear arms? Does carrying a weapon into a school zone have anything to do with commerce or interstate and foreign trade? Was another big question here. If we look at the ruling, the Supreme Court decided, and this is one of the very few times that the Supreme Court has ever used judicial review and overturned an act of Congress that was based on the Commerce Clause. Because a lot of the laws that Congress passes, they always, very often they use the Commerce Clause to justify those. Where they say, well, this law has something to do with money, with business, with trade in the United States. Even if it's a stretch, like obviously this is a pretty big stretch here. So the national government does not have the power to restrict gun possession in a school zone based on the Commerce Clause. And the further significance of this case could also say that this was a big 10th Amendment case. So the 10th Amendment to the Constitution is the one that grants the reserved powers to the states. So the Constitution expresses specific powers to the national government. And the 10th Amendment states that anything that's not covered in the Constitution, anything that's not specifically granted as a power to the national level of government, the states reserve all those powers. And an argument here was schools fall under the reserved powers. It doesn't say anything about schools in the Constitution, so anything dealing with schools should be left up to the states to decide. So Engel versus Vitale, 1962. So the case mainly revolved around the New York Board of Regents, which is like the New York Board of Education at the state level. They authorized or gave permission for each school, each public school, which makes this a big deal because private schools do this and it's not a big deal. But they allowed public schools to have a short voluntary prayer for recitation at the beginning of each school day. So they would start out with the Pledge of Allegiance, and kind of like we do during homeroom, we have the Pledge of Allegiance and then we do the moment of silence. Well, instead of the moment of silence, they had a voluntary prayer. And part of the big deal about this case is they actually had a script that they encouraged students to read. Once again, you didn't have to, but it was encouraged. And the script read, "Almighty God, we acknowledge our Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country." So that's what students were encouraged to say. So there were certain organizations, as well as groups of parents, including Engel was one of the parents, who challenged this based on the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And the First Amendment says that the national government does not have the right to establish any specific religion that we have to follow. In other words, there is a separation between church and state. So, according to the First Amendment, government and religion are not supposed to go together. There has to be a separation there. But at the same time, the First Amendment also has the Free Exercise Clause, which says you have to allow people to worship whatever religion they would like to freely. So some of the key questions here is, number one, since the prayer was encouraged, yet voluntary, meaning you didn't have to do it, did this really violate the Establishment Clause? Was the government of New York, because this is public schools, this is government-run schools, was the government of New York really pushing religion on anybody? Also, since the prayer was not specific to any particular religion, not necessarily Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and so on, was it promoted under the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment? Was this actually allowing people to exercise their religion freely? I mean, obviously, one of the things you'd have to keep in mind here is, what about people who weren't religious at all? It said God in the prayer. What about agnostics or atheists, or maybe someone of a religion who worshiped multiple gods? There was only a single God mentioned in the script here. So the ruling was the prayer violated the Establishment Clause, and the government has no business drafting formal prayers for recitation in a government-funded setting. So in a private school setting, it's not a big deal because private schools are not as heavily regulated by the government. Funding for private schools comes from the parents who want to send their children there. Funding for public schools, which are the subject of this case, comes from everybody who lives in town, regardless of whether you want to fund the public school, regardless of whether your children go there, you still have to pay for the school. It's a government-run school. So private schools, they're not government-run. They're not funded by all taxpayers. So private schools can have prayer. They can require prayer. Not a big deal. Public schools, well, they're trying to establish that separation of church and state. Wisconsin versus Yoder, 1972. So this case revolves around a parent, and there are a couple other parents, but the main parent here was Jonas Yoder. He was a follower of the Amish religion. He actually had legal charges brought against him by the state of Wisconsin for not sending his children to public school after 8th grade. His argument and other parents who were prosecuted under the same law argued that a high school education went against the beliefs, the religious beliefs of the Amish people. So with the Amish religion, it's all about a very simple life. You're self-sufficient. It's not about having worldly views. You're kind of closed in a small, tight-knit community. and they felt that beyond 8th grade, you stop learning basic skills that every person would need to know. And when you go into high school, you start to learn more about how to be a citizen of American society, as well as a member of the international community. And that goes against their beliefs of being within their own community. They felt there were conflicting beliefs between general American society and the Amish community. And they would prefer to have their kids at home, whether they chose to homeschool them or have them work. That was kind of, the parents thought they should be able to decide after 8th grade. So the state of Wisconsin, they had a law at the time that you had to attend public school until the age of 16, which would be roughly around 10th grade. So you have about a 2-year gap there between what the Amish wanted and what the state wanted. So the key questions: does the free exercise clause of the First Amendment exempt certain students from attending school past a certain age? So this was a First Amendment free exercise clause case. The Amish were arguing that the law that they had to send their kids to public school until 16 was interfering with their ability to worship their religion the way they saw best fit. The other big question here: was there really a significant difference in the educational outcomes of an 8th grader, so approximately someone who's 14 years old, versus a 16-year-old? Does that extra 2 years really make that much of a difference where the state should be able to require it? So the ruling in this case, the parents' interest in the free exercise clause outweighed the state's interest in mandatory school attendance through the age of 16. And one of the main reasons that the Supreme Court came up with this ruling was based on the Amish community. So the Amish community has a very long track record of being a law-abiding group of citizens. They pay their taxes. In general, they do not accept welfare benefits, even if they are eligible for them, so they're not viewed as a drain on the system. And there was no evidence that if you let their kids, I don't want to say drop out, but if you let their kids stop attending school 2 years earlier, there was no evidence at the time that this would change any of that. The fact that they were law-abiding, tax-paying, and not going on a bunch of welfare services that would cost other residents a lot more money in the long run. Further significance of this case is this was a big homeschooling case. So this ruling served as a basis for parents' rights to homeschool their children, and you started to see this movement increase afterwards. Because in the 1930s, you saw a very big step up with public education. From state to state, they started to really make uniform laws saying, okay, most kids have to go to school, a public school or a private school, until age 16. They were trying to get rid of child labor at the time, and they figured if you had to require kids to go to school, then that would end child labor. But after this case, you saw a lot of those kids start to be homeschooled. All right, so Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District, 1969. This is one of the most high-profile cases here. A lot of people have actually heard about this, even if you're not taking AP government. So, 1965, the United States is involved in the Vietnam War at that point. The Vietnam War was part of our containment policy to stop the spread of communism worldwide. At the time, South Vietnam was being threatened by a communist takeover by North Vietnam. And there was a group of guerrilla warfare type fighters in the South called the Viet Cong, who were trying to terrorize South Vietnam and help them fall. So the United States was getting very involved in this conflict. It was a very unpopular conflict for a lot of Americans throughout the 1960s and through the 1970s, which we finally dropped out of the war in the early to mid 1970s. So a lot of people protested it. One of the things that really bothered people about Vietnam was that there was a draft. So there were a lot of young kids, 18 years old, who were getting forced into military service. They were getting sent over to Vietnam, and they were dying in this battle against communism that, quite frankly, a lot of people in the United States didn't really understand exactly why we were over there. They didn't really understand how much of a threat communism posed to the world at the time, and they thought this was not something the U.S. should be involved in. So in 1965, a group of students at this school wore black armbands. You can see them in this picture here. There's a brother and a sister who were involved, that pretty much the leaders of this protest. And they wanted a truce in the Vietnam War. They wanted to see South and North Vietnam come to some kind of agreement, and the United States and the Soviet Union, who were also involved in this indirectly, to all come to some kind of peace agreement and just end the fighting. So the school created a policy to ask students to remove the armbands, with suspension resulting for those who refused. One of the big issues in this case is before the students ever wore the armbands into school, school administrators had heard about the plans for them to do so, and they created a policy beforehand. So they never gave a chance for the students to wear the armbands in a classroom setting to see if it actually posed any type of distraction, which would come back to kind of haunt the school in the Supreme Court decision. Some key questions. Obviously, does a prohibition against the wearing of armbands in public school as a form of symbolic speech or protest? All right, so nothing's actually being said here. When we talk about the First Amendment, we think of freedom of speech, we think about people talking. Well, there's other ways of expressing freedom of speech. All right, this is your freedom of expression. This is symbolic speech. You're not actually saying anything with words, but you're saying it with symbols, in this case, the black armband. So the question is, does not allowing these students to wear this, does that violate their freedom of speech protections guaranteed by the First Amendment? And the other big question is, did the armbands actually prove to be a distraction to the educational process? So the ruling in this case was, well, the students did wear the armbands, just to give you a little context here, and they were suspended from school. The Supreme Court ruled that the suspension from school violated the First Amendment rights of the students. And some of the justification for this ruling is the armbands did not prove disruptive to the educational process. The students were quiet and respectful. They didn't do anything that caused any type of riot in the classroom. It was simply they were wearing these armbands, and that's it. But they did it in a very peaceful, respectful way. There was nothing disruptive. Another part of the ruling here, and kind of a significant outcome, is in the 14th Amendment, and we'll be talking more about this in the future. There's a due process clause. So, and you actually covered this in the last homework assignment that you did that's due tonight. It gets into the 14th Amendment and the idea of incorporation, or selective incorporation, we call it. So when the Bill of Rights was originally created, the purpose of the Bill of Rights was to protect citizens from actions of the national government. So when you really break it down, the way the framers intended it was the national government couldn't take away your freedom of speech. The national government couldn't pass laws to take away your right to bear arms. But that didn't stop state governments or local governments. Let's say a school board, for example, would be an extension of local or state government. That wouldn't stop them from violating your First Amendment rights, because the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, is just preventing the national government from infringing those rights. Well, the 14th Amendment changed that, because in the 14th Amendment, it specifically says that states cannot take away any privileges or immunities of citizens, which would be some of those rights and freedoms that are granted in the Bill of Rights. And they cannot, the state government and local governments cannot take away due process, which means they cannot take away your basic legal rights, that process you have to go through if you face some kind of charge or some kind of crime. So this was a big victory for the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, and it pretty much solidified that, hey, these Bill of Rights, these first 10 amendments, not only do they apply to the national government, but state governments also have to follow these as well.